Good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, so let's get started. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren, and I'm just going to start with a land acknowledgement. Can everyone hear me? Is this good? Okay. All right, so the city of Halifax is situated on the Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. Okay, thanks. So this session today is the role of data in measuring progress and in adapting solutions. The presentations in this session all deal with collecting and using data to tailor services to needs. The first will present key findings from the 2020 to 2022 nationally coordinated point-in-time counts on the impact of COVID-19 on homelessness, as well as an overview of the PIT counts and their role in advancing our understanding of homelessness. The second will describe how newly available national administrative shelter data show how COVID-19 pandemic tested the flexibility and resiliency of Canada's emergency shelter system. It reveals how communities and service providers quickly adapted their service models to provide shelter to those who need it. Finally, presenters will summarize the methodology behind the 2020 Winnipeg Street Census, as well as what it revealed about the experiences of homelessness in the city with a focus on Indigenous homelessness. All right. To start, we're going to start with Everyone Counts, the 2020 to 2022 findings from the nationally coordinated point-in-time counts, led by Shaji Kwayam. Sorry, there we go. All right. Saji joined the public sector in Montreal in 2016 as payment service officer for the Canadian Pension Plan and Old Age Security. He moved to Ottawa to pursue his passion of data analysis and research, and currently works on the homelessness analysis team for Reaching Home, the Government of Canada's homelessness program. He supports on initiatives such as the point-in-time counts and works to advance research to better understand the experience of homelessness across Canada. Besides his interest in research and data, he loves to keep active by playing sports, carpentry, working on cars, going to the gym, and enjoying the great indoors.
Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's doing good today. All right, so thank you for coming to today's session with regards to the point-in-time counts, and thank you, Lauren, for the quick intro. I'm glad to see that there's so much interest in the data coming from point-in-time counts, and that I just want to acknowledge there has been a great effort, a huge effort on part of communities, as well as shelter service, people working in the shelter service sector. Good point. All right, there we go. So before I start, I'd just like to do a quick acknowledgement that we are all gathered here today in Jibuktuk, also known as Halifax, in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Let's get into this. All right, so what are the point-in-time counts? Well, the point-in-time counts has two general purposes. The first being an enumeration or count of people experiencing homelessness within a community or shelter and on the streets on a given night. The second is that there's the implementation of the survey that provides communities with information on the demographics, the service needs of people affected by homelessness. Communities can also use the data from the point-in-time counts to obtain a better understanding of homelessness, including those who are not accessing shelters, as well as to identify populations that may benefit from specific targeted services, and also, of course, to help target community resources to where they are most needed. All right. I know, right? I'm just trying to I'm like, we need some background music over here or something. All right, okay. So, in general, there's been three nationally coordinated point-in-time counts. The first one being in 2016, with the participation of 32 communities. The second one, which occurred between March and April of 2018, with 61 communities. And of course, the most recent point-in-time counts, which took place during the whole COVID-19 pandemic, between March of 2020 all the way through December 2022. This specific point in time count included 72 communities that had conducted enumerations across the country. Excellent. Can I ask you to Google it? Awesome, thank you very much. All right, so let's get into the enumeration findings. 2022 point in time counts enumerated over 40,000 people experiencing homelessness across, I don't think that was me, across 72 communities on a given day. So in comparison to the 2018 counts, this represented an increase of 20% for the total number of people experiencing homelessness. We also see certain increases within the different locations, such as unsheltered and sheltered homelessness, and more specifically for unsheltered homelessness, which increased by 88%. When looking at the overall rate of homelessness across participating communities, so the 72 communities that conducted the point in time counts, about 13 people were found to be experiencing homelessness for every 10,000 people in population. And higher rates were seen in the western and northern region, where it was 17 people for every 10,000 people in population from the 2021 census numbers. Awesome. All right, so the following slides that I'll be going after now will be looking at the survey data from the point in time counts. The survey data consisted of an additional 13 communities to those that had already done the enumeration. So that gives a total of 85 communities and regions for that data set. That data itself was comprised of responses from the survey questions, which were reviewed and categorized in order to be able to conduct certain analyses. Next slide. So survey data show that the majority of respondents were adults, aged between 25 to 49. This was followed by older adults aged 50 to 64, representing around 24%, and youth aged 13 to 24, representing 12%. Men were found to be the most prevalent, representing almost 2/3 of all respondents, while 35% identified as women and 3% identified as gender diverse. Survey data also show that men were also older on average than women and gender diverse respondents. The next slide here, we'll be looking at the duration of homelessness. So what we see is that over 2/3 of respondents reported experiencing homelessness for a total of 6 or more months over the past year. So this relates to the definition of chronic homelessness, but it's not exactly the same definition, because the definition of chronic homelessness includes this, of the experiencing homelessness for 6 months or more over the past year, as well as another component, which is and/or, experiencing homelessness for over a past of 3 years for about a year and a half. But point in time count, given the limited capacity of it, only looks at for the current year, or the past 12 months. Let's see here, where was I? Yeah. So in comparison to the 2018 counts, this also represents an increase. In 2018, the point in time counts had saw that 60% of respondents had reported experiencing homelessness for 6 months or more for the past year. We also see that this rate of experiencing this longer duration of homelessness is higher among people that are living in unsheltered locations, so in parks, outdoor locations, also including encampments. And we also see that respondents in the western and northern region were also found to be more likely to report experiencing this duration, representing nearly 3/4, whereas those in central region and the eastern region represented 63% and 68% respectively. Right, so this one here, the point in time count also looks at what aged respondent had first experienced homelessness. So what we see is that 44% of people reported experiencing homelessness for the first time under the age of 25, or as a youth or a child. It's also possible to say that early experiences of homelessness may have longer term impacts. This can be seen by the peaks during the teen years, although it's not that visible for the senior one, which is the gray one on the bottom, but it's still there, that we have in the chart there. Right. And we also see the percentage generally decreased with age, where 55% of respondents experience homelessness for the first time as a senior, when we look at around the age of 65 and over. Now this one here, it's one of my favorite slides with regards to reasons for housing loss. So this question in general is a multiple choice question where respondents can choose more than one option, given that the experience of homelessness is not just caused by one factor. There's multiple factors contributing towards that. So the most common response that we saw from respondents for this question was having insufficient income for housing, which was reported for more than a quarter of respondents. So I think it was 28%, as seen on the slide there. The second most reported response was substance use issues. So this one was 18%. Now, Most age groups also reported insufficient income as their primary reason for housing loss. However, nearly a third of youth respondents, reported conflict with parent or guardian as their primary reason for why they had lost their housing within the last 12 months. We also found differences for specific populations. For example, we saw that women were found to be 6 more times likely to report abuse by a partner or spouse compared to men. So I believe it was 13% compared to 2%. And those that identified as 2 as LGBTQI+, cited mental health issues and also conflict with parent or guardian more often than their counterparts. So COVID-19, nobody likes talking about this one, but it's part of what the history is of point-in-time counts now. So as the PIT counts of 2020-2022 took place during the COVID-19 pandemic, an additional follow-up question was added to the PIT count survey. In particular, it was added after the reasons for housing question that was presented just in the last slide. So the survey results show that 12% of respondents actually attributed their recent housing loss to COVID, and that this rate stayed relatively stable between the mid-pandemic and the late pandemic period. Just to get a quick definition on the mid and the late, mid-pandemic refers to those that had conducted PIT counts during the year of 2021, whereas those that had conducted PIT counts in 2022 were part of the late pandemic period. We also see that almost half of those who reported COVID-19 as a reason for housing loss also reported financial reasons, specifically not having income as another contributing factor. Whereas in comparison to those who did not report COVID-19 as a reason for housing loss, we see that is about a quarter, just over, like 26% of respondents that had said that it was their reason for housing loss was due to financial reasons or not having enough income. Next slide. Health challenges. So this was actually one of the new data points that we collected through the 2020-2022 point-in-time counts. So a significant majority, consisting of about 85% of respondents, reported having at least one health challenge. When you look at it a bit more in depth, we see that just over 2/3 reported 2 or more health challenges. We also see that substance use and mental health challenges being represented some of the higher rates, and they had similar rates in general, 61% and 60% respectively. And we also see here with the chart that the type of health challenge differed with age. Youth were more likely to report mental health and learning or cognitive limitations, but this proportion decreased with age. And the opposite is true for illness or medical condition and physical limitations, where we see that it is higher at older age groups and lower in younger. So this can be interpreted as how respondents were likely to have more illnesses as they got older due to age. So as you get older, more chances of getting physical issues or say health issues. And in contrast with those that are reporting learning or cognitive limitations are younger, and they're more likely to be aware of these type of issues. They're more likely to get diagnosed with them. They're more likely to be talking about it more frequently. Next slide. So, experiences of youth in care. This is yet another new data point that we collected from the 2020-2022 point-in-time counts. So this new question was added to help study how past experiences of being in foster care, youth group homes, or other child welfare programs may contribute to experiences of homelessness. This data shows that nearly a third of respondents reported having experiences of being a youth in care. This proportion was found to be highest among those spending the night in unsheltered locations, in systems such as hospitals, treatment centers, jails, prisons, remand centers, and among those who reported that they were experiencing hidden homelessness, or in other words, staying with others or couch surfing. Respondents who reported having experienced as a youth in care had also reported earlier experiences of homelessness. So they were more likely to experience homelessness at an earlier age. So it shows that just over 2/3 reported experiencing homelessness for the first time before the age of 25, so as a youth or a child, and which was lower among those without experiences of youth in care. We also see that respondents who had experience of being a youth in care were more likely than those without to have higher rates for almost all the health challenges that were mentioned on the previous slide, with the largest difference seen for substance use, learning or cognitive limitations, as well as mental health issues. Awesome. So for 2S LGBTQI+, we had taken the responses from two specific questions, those being the gender identity question and the sexual orientation question. So members of this group in general were found to be overrepresented among those that are experiencing homelessness, where 30% of all survey respondents identified as being a member of the 2S LGBTQI community. In comparison, only 4% of the Canadian population identified as being a part of this group. We also found that youth respondents were more likely to identify as being a member of 2S LGBTQI+, representing 26%, and were also more likely to experience homelessness for the first time before the age of 18 even. So this slide here talks about Indigenous identity. So respondents were asked if they identified as Indigenous or had Indigenous ancestry. Nearly 1/3 of respondents, 31%, identified as Indigenous, with the majority identifying as First Nations. This is also similar to findings from this 2021 census, where 58% of those who were identified as Indigenous were First Nations. The data from the census also show that approximately 5% of Canadians identified as Indigenous. So this basically suggests an overrepresentation of Indigenous people experiencing homelessness, which is similar to what we had also found in 2018, so this continues onwards now. Indigenous respondents were also likely to report earlier experience of homelessness, the majority of whom had reported experiencing homelessness before the age of 25 and decreased with age, following a different trend among non-Indigenous people, where the peak of first experiences are more likely to happen in adulthood. Indigenous respondents were also more than 2 times likely to report having experiences as a youth in care compared to non-Indigenous respondents. So the percentages respectively was 51% for those who are identifying as Indigenous and 22% for those who are identifying as non-Indigenous respondents. So we also have other additional findings, of course. For instance, data on racial identity. This was also collected for the first time during the point-in-time counts in 2020-2022. What we see here from the data is that slide's a bit weird. So nearly 1 in 5 respondents identified as being a member of a racialized group. And in particular, those that had identified as being Black represented 8% of all respondents, which is double the percentage seen in the 2021 census. Survey results also show that almost 1/3 of respondents identified as a newcomer. In other words, as a recent newcomer. The difference being that those who are recent came within the last 5 years, and we also found that they were more likely to be in central Canada than other places. We also see that 40% of respondents had identified as, 40% of recent newcomers identified as being a refugee claimant. Also, similar to the 2018 counts, the proportion of veterans remain overrepresented among those who are experiencing homelessness. About 5% of respondents reported serving in the Canadian Army, Air Force, or Navy, or in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. In comparison, the 2021 census found 1.5% of the population identifying as veterans. So, I would like to acknowledge, again, the efforts of the homelessness serving organizations, municipal staff, emergency services, volunteers who had participated in making these counts a success. The third nationally point-in-time counts took place during an unprecedented time due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic affected the regular timeframes for the counts, as the counts took place between, as I mentioned, March 2020 to December 2022, much longer than the usual March to April of 1 year. It also imposed an added level of complexity on communities, since additional measures were necessary to ensure the health and well-being for all participants. The results also show that there have been an increase in the number of people who are experiencing homelessness, in particular those who are staying in unsheltered locations, as well as an increase in the rates of people experiencing chronic homelessness for durations of 6 months or more. Additionally, we also see continued overrepresentation among respondents who are Indigenous, veterans, and those who are members of the 2S LGBTQ community, as well as those who are identifying as a Black respondent. The findings from the counts in general can be used to reevaluate the distribution of services within communities in order to help those who are most vulnerable. This recent round of PIT counts addressed data gaps by collecting data on health conditions, experiences of youth in care, and racial identity. This information can serve as a baseline moving forward and help to provide a better understanding of the experiences of homelessness and the possible contributors. So thank you again for your interest, and of course, I'm open to questions. My contact there, as well as the general inbox for our homeless analysis team. Thank you.
All right, thanks again, Saji. Next up, we have the National State of Homelessness by Annie Duchesne, sorry. Annie has worked in homelessness data analysis since 2014. She's a senior policy analyst for the Reaching Home Homelessness Policy Directorate and the lead researcher for the National Shelter Study. She has previously worked on other national projects, including the Estimate of Chronic Homelessness and the Shelter Capacity Report. Great. Welcome, Annie. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Hang on, I'm gonna get really close. Can you hear me? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today to talk about this and other data issues. Next slide. I'm here to discuss the findings from the National Shelter Study and ongoing analysis of emergency shelter data used to estimate the annual number of people who use shelters in Canada. So while Saji gets the point in time, which is a one-night count and estimate, I get the annual number of emergency shelter users. Next slide, please. We will be releasing a full National Shelter Study report in the coming months that talks about methods in greater detail for those who are interested, but I'm not going to bore you with all the details today, so you don't have to worry. Essentially, the study is designed to obtain accurate estimates of the number of shelter users and their demographics, including age and gender. It also tracks overall pressure on the shelter system by looking at occupancy rates as well. Next slide. Slide? Yeah, perfect one. Okay, so what's different about this version of the National Shelter Study? I'm just going to go over this really quickly. So accurate shelter capacity statistics are a key part of the study design. Our researchers worked to collect data for 2 time points in 2020, pre and post-pandemic, to determine the impact that COVID had on the service sector and to ensure that our estimates were properly weighed in this study. And you can see the COVID capacity adjustment factor here. For all those who are interested, we had, this was developed in collaboration with the statistical methods experts at INFC. A fully detailed methodology will be available in an upcoming publication. So if you are interested in reading all of the equations, that will be available to you.
That's why we're in here, not in the musical.
That's right, exactly. Isn't this fun? Okay. Yeah. You're my people. Okay, so shelter beds, they dropped by almost a quarter between March and April 2020, which is a huge deal. Social distancing measures, maybe staff shortages also may have driven the decrease. By 2021, the system had largely recovered with only a 1.5% decrease in permanent beds compared to 2019. So before we discuss the results, let's talk a little bit, sorry, I keep forgetting to ask you to advance the slides one more. Before we discuss the results, let's talk a little bit about limitations. While there were reductions in shelter use, this should not necessarily be equated with reduction in homelessness. This analysis does not capture homelessness in other contexts, including those temporary shelters that opened, unsheltered and hidden homelessness, which was rampant throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So just keeping that in mind. Okay, next slide. Oh, we're going to skip this one too. Okay, so let's look at long-term trends first. You can see a gradual decrease in shelter use between 2005 and 2019. Then, as would be expected with a big drop in shelter beds, there was a drop in 2020 and a partial recovery in 2021. You may be, on an average night in 2021, there were about 13,000 people staying in shelters. You may be asking why this number is lower than what's reported in the point-in-time counts. And this is because this number reflects only emergency shelter use and excludes things like domestic violence shelters, temporary motel programs, et cetera, which were included in the point-in-time counts. Okay? Next slide, please. Okay. So why are we seeing this large drop? Can mostly be explained by the loss of permanent emergency shelter beds during the first year of the pandemic. So in 2020, the number of available beds dropped by a quarter. This was likely in response to staffing shortages, social distancing guidelines. Many services opened up temporary spaces elsewhere, which we were unable to include. Occupancy, however, remained high, both in 2020 and 2021. It dropped in 2021, however. In 2020, there were fewer beds, but those beds were full. And in 2021, the bed numbers had mostly recovered, but the shelter use did not increase at the same rate. This is probably due to a combination of factors, so including ongoing shelter avoidance due to the pandemic, continued use of temporary shelters, and policies like CERB and rent moratoria. Next slide. Okay. The high occupancy rate over the past couple of years, even though there's fewer people in shelter, was driven by longer stays in shelter. So among family shelter users, the average stay increased by over 25 days over the time period, compared to youth shelters where the average length of stay increased by only 2 days, and adult shelters which increased by 9 days. This may be a reflection in the difficulty in finding safe, affordable, and appropriate housing for family units. Okay, we'll skip this one too. Let's talk about demographics. So starting off with gender, the proportion of men and women has remained statistically unchanged between 2015 and 2021. However, a significant increase in the proportion of shelter users reporting as gender diverse was observed. This may be because of better data collection practices, but we're seeing it regardless. Okay. The age distribution among shelter users has remained relatively stable over time as well, with the exception of unaccompanied youth, which have decreased over time, which is a bit of a good news story, I would say. We went from about 18% in 2015 to 13% in 2021, which is a big drop. Next slide. Okay. Like we have seen in previous years, Indigenous peoples were overrepresented in 2021 among shelter users compared to the general population. However, this may still underrepresent the truth of Indigenous peoples experiencing homelessness due to a disincentive to disclose. For example, people may not wish to disclose Indigenous status because they've experienced discrimination in social services spaces in the past, or may be concerned that the racist application of child protection service policies will see them separated from their children. The PIC counts find a higher proportion of Indigenous peoples who are unsheltered as well, indicating shelter avoidance. Okay, next slide. There has been an increase in the proportion of Indigenous identifying shelter users since 2015, though the trend is not statistically significant at the P is greater than 0.05 level. Why are we concerned with the statistical evidence when the trends look like this and the communities and advocates are clearly saying that this is an issue? We just want to be very transparent about the limitations of our data, not to be able to detect these changes over time. It does not indicate that there's definitely not an increase. It means that we can't say either way using this particular data set. In this and all cases, we need to combine multiple sources of evidence in order to get a clearer sense of what's actually happening. Looking year over year, we can say with a statistical certainty that Indigenous peoples are consistently overrepresented in the shelter system by a lot, and this represents a fundamental failing of the system to protect Indigenous peoples from poverty and homelessness. Next slide. Veteran shelter users are on par with the proportion found in the general population, which is a bit different from the statistics that Saji showed. While we've been seeing a significant downward trend in slope of proportion, while we've been seeing a general downward trend, it's not a statistically significant finding. And I can talk about maybe why the PIT counts are a little bit higher as we go into things like the chronic analysis. Okay, next slide. Okay, in 2021, and basically all years, the majority of shelter users were Canadian citizens. The proportion of refugee and refugee claimants in the shelter system decreased from a peak of 4.1% in 2019 to less than 1% in 2021. This is likely because of pandemic travel restrictions, a decrease in the number of asylum claims in 2020 and 2021. I expect that as we look forward, these numbers will bounce back. Okay, let's talk about chronic shelter use. And I just want to say this is the work of one of my colleagues, Sichin Guo, who has done amazing work in looking more deeply at the demographics and the patterns of shelter use among chronic users. So I just want to give a shout out to her. Okay, so again, some definitions here. We've made a distinction between acute chronicity, that is lots of shelter stays or less shelter use over a 1-year period, and what we're calling prolonged instability, shelter stays over multiple years. To be clear, this is just kind of the terminology that we're using to identify distinct groups. No definitions have been changed. So next slide. Okay. In 2021, an estimated almost 29,000, about 31% of people experienced chronic homelessness. Okay, next slide. The profile has changed over time. So while the total number of people experiencing chronic homelessness in shelter has remained stable, the types of chronicity experienced have been different lately. So acute chronicity increased between 2017 and 2020. And then remained stable. And then prolonged instability remained stable from 2017 to 2020 and then decreased. The combined profile, those who experienced both acute and prolonged chronicity, was relatively stable and then increased. So we're seeing the pandemic definitely had an impact on how people were using the shelter system and how long they were staying. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the rates of chronic homelessness differed across age groups. Children were the most likely to experience acute chronicity. This is probably because children are accessing shelters as part of a family unit, and it takes a long time to find appropriate housing for families. So youth were least likely to experience any kind of chronic homelessness, and older adults and seniors had the highest prevalence of combined chronic homelessness, which is not that much of a surprise given that they've had a time to accumulate. Okay. Men were most likely to experience prolonged instability and combined chronic homelessness. Women had a higher rate of acute chronicity, again, probably because of that family profile. There was not enough data to detect a statistically significant differences between those gender diverse groups and men and women, unfortunately. Okay. The rate of chronic homelessness among shelter users who reported that they were Indigenous was similar to the rate of non-Indigenous shelter users. However, the profiles were very different. So Indigenous shelter users had a higher rate of prolonged instability, that is many, many years of chronic homelessness, and non-Indigenous shelter users had a higher rate of acute chronicity. Among veterans, veterans had slightly higher chronic homelessness rate than non-veterans. They also had a higher rate of prolonged instability than non-veterans. And again, non-veterans had a higher rate of acute chronicity than veterans. In 2020 and 2021, refugee claimants and refugees had the highest prevalence of chronic homelessness. Canadian citizens had a higher rate of prolonged instability, and non-citizens were most likely to experience that acute chronicity and combined chronic homelessness. We would expect that because, of course, people are waiting for a decision, and it takes a long time. Next slide. That's it. That's it for me. Thank goodness. Okay.
Thank you, Annie. That was great. All right, I'd like to welcome up our next presenters. We have Josh Brandon from the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg. Josh is a community animator at the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg, and he is the lead author of the 2020 Winnipeg Street Census. He is a member of the Right to Housing Coalition of Winnipeg and an activist working to end homelessness. And co-presenting, we have Elijah Oseyoba. He is the Evaluations and Shared Measurement Manager at End Homelessness Winnipeg. And they will be presenting the Better Data for Ending Homelessness lessons from the Winnipeg Street Census today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. I'm Elijah Osayabwa, as she said there, Evaluation and Shared Measurement Manager at End Homelessness Winnipeg. I oversaw the planning and implementation of Winnipeg's 2022 Street Census or pit counts. Today, Josh and I, Josh being my co-presenter, we will share the methodology we use for our street census, limitations with our methodology, findings from the research, as well as recommendations for addressing homelessness in Winnipeg. Sorry. Okay. So I said today we will share the methodology we use for our pet count, challenges with the approach that we used, and findings from our report, as well as recommendations for addressing homelessness in Winnipeg. Next slide, yeah. Okay. Next slide. Yeah, this is the map of Winnipeg. This shows that Manitoba lies at the central part of Canada, and Winnipeg is Manitoba's capital city. There are about 750,000 people in Winnipeg. And Winnipeg has the largest Indigenous urban population in Canada, with over 100,000 people identifying as Indigenous within the city. It should also be said that Manitoba, we voted for our first First Nations Premier just last month, and he has promised to end homelessness in Manitoba in 10 years. So we hope that that comes into fruition. This graph provides more context, and it compares the average rent for bachelor units in 7 major Canadian cities. And as the graph shows, rent is the lowest in Winnipeg and Montreal. However, this graph shows that for low-income earners, as defined as households which earn less than $27K a year, they don't find housing in Winnipeg affordable at all. As a matter of fact, just 4.2% of rental units in Winnipeg are accessible to this category of people. Yeah, this slide shows the methodology we use for our bed count. And Homelessness Winnipeg, the organization I work with, and Social Planning Council of Winnipeg, the organization my colleague works with, we co-led the planning and implementation of Winnipeg's most recent street census or pet count. We had support from 22 community partners. This included the City of Winnipeg, outreach teams, housing providers, those with lived and living homelessness experience, and elder and other stakeholders. We started by creating 4 working groups and a steering committee. The steering committee set direction for the work, and an elder sat on the steering committee. The 4 working groups, each of them had a rep on the steering committee, and what they did was they reported to the steering committee on the work that their groups were doing, and then they took steering committee decisions back to the working groups. We use the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness definition of homelessness, and this includes those who are unsheltered, those who are staying at shelters, those who were provisionally accommodated, but we excluded those who are at risk of homelessness. We gathered our data from two main sources. The first was over 160 volunteers and outreach teams work together to administer surveys. For the surveys, they had 21 questions. Most of the questions were set by Saji's team, Reaching Home, but we had a chance to add locally relevant questions to the survey. We also relied on data from HIFIS, and for the HIFIS data, we used data on those staying in shelters, data on those in transitional housing programs, as well as data on those in institutional care with no fixed addresses. We had some challenges with our methodology. The first is we unaccounted hidden homelessness. I'm sure a lot of you already know this. For those who are couch surfing, it's very difficult to reach this category of people experiencing homelessness. For the next bit counts, our intention is we will organize magnet events, and we are speaking with Cs which have done this in the past to learn from their experience, so we don't make any mistakes with this. Our methodology did not capture seasonal variations in homelessness in Winnipeg. In Winnipeg, in the summer, you see a lot of encampments, you see a lot of unsheltered homelessness, but then due to the harsh weather conditions within the city, in the winter, you don't see as many people who live rough on the street. However, since this was a point-in-time count, it didn't reflect the seasonal changes in the number of those experiencing homelessness within the city. Some government departments didn't share data with us. I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but we didn't receive data on those staying at correctional facilities with no fixed addresses from Manitoba Justice, so we weren't able to include them this time around. Our outreach teams and volunteers focused on where those experiencing homelessness within the city usually converge at, and this will be in and around downtown Winnipeg. So for those experiencing homelessness elsewhere in the city, there's a chance that the outreach teams and volunteers might have missed them. Some organizations were very stretched, so unfortunately they were not able to participate this time around. And the biggest challenge that we faced was with volunteer recruitment and training. In the previous years, we used over 300 volunteers, but I don't know if this is just Winnipeg or perhaps other jurisdictions are also experiencing this. We did our best, however, we were able to recruit over 200 volunteers. After the training, this number dropped to around 160. So for the next bit count, what we are planning to do is to use only outreach teams. And again, thanks to Sergio, he's connected me with other cities which I've worked with only outreach teams, and we want to speak with them and then learn from them. Hopefully that will help us avoid the issues that we had with the volunteers. I'll share some findings from the pit count. We found 1,256 people who were experiencing homelessness in the city, and this is just a tip of the iceberg. It doesn't reflect the entire number of people experiencing homelessness in Winnipeg. We've already talked about hidden homelessness. So that is one of the reasons why our number doesn't reflect the total number of people experiencing homelessness in the city. Another reason is this was a voluntary survey, so some people might have declined not to participate. But that is a breakdown of that number. There were 123 people who lived unsheltered, so that included those staying at ATM vestibules, bus shelters, encampments, tents, etc. 422 people stayed in different types of shelters. 405 were provisionally accommodated. And if you look at those who were staying at someone else's place, we found 132 people. That clearly shows you that we're not able to capture the entire number of people experiencing homelessness. We've seen research from other jurisdictions pointing to the fact that hidden homelessness is about 3 times the size of those experiencing all the other types of homelessness. And there were 306 people who did not disclose their location. this has been mentioned already, but it's more pronounced in Winnipeg. I mentioned that Winnipeg has the largest urban Indigenous population in the whole of Canada. However, when it comes to homelessness, even though just 14% of Winnipeggers identify as Indigenous, as high as 75% of those experiencing homelessness identify as Indigenous. First Nations alone constitute more than half of those experiencing homelessness in Winnipeg. And I will turn it over to my colleague to continue from here. Thanks.
I'm a little bit shorter, so, and I'll try not to sing either. So the findings here, I think like other communities across Canada, we saw a large group of people experiencing homelessness in the adult age range. We saw a significant group of people who are elders tragically experiencing homelessness, which nobody should be, but it's especially hard on the body as you age. And then also we did find a lot of younger people as well. And we believe that that's probably underrepresented because those groups are more likely in hidden homelessness circumstances, couch surfing and that sort of thing. Similarly, like a lot of other communities across Canada, a significant portion of people experiencing homelessness are male compared to female. But again, we know that there's a lot, the shelter system, people sleeping rough are less likely, women are less likely in those situations where we were able to reach out to people more likely in hidden homelessness and situations where we're not encountering them. So again, these are underestimates, we believe. Looking at people under the age of 16, our survey doesn't, if people identify themselves as under the age of 16, we don't continue with the survey because of ethical constraints, and so that's going to be an underrepresentation as well. Those people who are under 16 were mostly in family units, in family shelters and that sort of thing, so we had a small number there. So this slide shows source of income. People had various sources of income. About half of people were relying on our social assistance system, either EIA, general assistance, or disability. A smaller portion had work experience or informal jobs, whether that's, and we counted things like, if you're collecting cans, that's work as well, right? So there's different experiences people have along that work continuum. But one of the things that really stood out to me in looking at these figures is the social assistance numbers, even though pretty much everybody who is experiencing homelessness should be eligible for social assistance in some form or another, whether it's the Rent Assist program or other social assistance programs. And we're missing so many people. There's one woman I talked to during the process, during the count, and she was telling me that she had been working with a worker in the EIA system, our social assistance system, who had been working with her for 3 months, trying to get her through all the hoops to get her the assistance she needed, and she still wasn't through. And she was, she lauded the woman for being, going over hoops and barriers to help her. It wasn't a lack of care or trying, it's just how complicated our system is that's failing so many people. And then the other side of that is that even though people are receiving social assistance, it's still not enough to keep them housed. And so we need to have much higher rates as well, clearly. Another fact here I just wanted to point out is only 4% of people are receiving the GST benefit. And that's for people, families, I forget what the cutoff range, 50,000 or something, 40,000, depending on your family size. I mean, why are we not getting all of those benefits? The climate action refunds and all of those benefits are just so hard for people who are experiencing homelessness to receive. And so we need to do a much better job at getting people the benefits that they're due. Next slide. I don't have too much to say about this. Education, clearly we need to increase access for people to education. It becomes a lifelong barrier for people if they're not able to complete high school, if they're not able to continue with their education system. This shows, again, Manitoba has the highest rates across the country of children in care, and it's 90% of children in care in Manitoba are Indigenous. So we have huge failings there, and it becomes a pipeline into homelessness. It becomes a pipeline into other systems of incarceration, and tragically, we also see it reflected in the high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people. So many of our sisters there went through the CFS system. And so we need to radically transform that. We see that about 50% of the people we talked to had spent time in the CFS system, and those rates are even higher for Indigenous people. This shows again although larger numbers of people experiencing homelessness were adults or older adults even, the big jump on when people first experiencing homelessness is those teenage years. The highest peak there is age 18. People just aging out of care of the CFS system go directly into homelessness. And we've heard stories of people, of workers, unfortunately, when they've been working with a family and then the kid ages out of care and the only option is to take them to a shelter. And so we need to have better transition supports there, obviously. And again, the family breakdown as well, we found as a similar pathway. So the cause of housing, not enough income for housing, again, is the highest rate there. As we heard in other communities, there's issues with conflict with parent, conflict with landlord, mental health and addictions all figure into it. It was obviously a complicated matrix of things, but the clear need for more affordable housing and better incomes to afford that housing is clearly there. So, our report, I encourage you to have a look at it, and it does provide some good recommendations. We put our recommendations into two big baskets. The first is we need to see a broad systems change. And so we need to have an EIA system that's supportive, that gives people a dignified income, that gets people enough income to support their housing. We need to transform our child welfare system, providing more Indigenous control of our child welfare system, because it's currently a colonial system and provides inadequate supports for kids aging out of care. We need to have, one of the things we found in Winnipeg in specific was the need to provide that transitional support for people moving from reserves into Winnipeg. There's a group that helps young people, Eagle Urban Transition Center, and we've worked with them, and they do some really amazing work for young people transitioning from reserve communities into Winnipeg. But we know far too often young people are coming from communities that are rural, remote communities that are nothing like Winnipeg, and just having the skills to navigate those various bureaucracies that people are coming into contact with when they come to Winnipeg. There's so many gaps in those systems. And so just as we provide supports for newcomers when they come to Winnipeg, and we should be providing those supports, we also recognize we need to provide more supports for Indigenous people who are going through often very traumatic or challenging cultural shift in moving those communities. The second basket of recommendations that we have is around providing more housing. I think we've seen the housing crisis across Canada. It's not much different in Winnipeg, although rents are nominally lower in Winnipeg than in many other communities. For low-income people, there's very little that's available. There's approximately 6,000 people in Winnipeg on our waiting list for social housing. And for so many families and so many individuals, the only options that are available are either inadequate housing, unaffordable housing, or choosing to sleep rough because it's actually more dangerous to be in the housing that's available at the price range that they can afford than to be in a tent by the river. And that's, so we need to be building at least 1,000 units a year for the next decade to get through that backlog and to create dignified housing for everyone. Thank you so much. These are our contact information.
All right, thanks again for that. That was great. We now have time for a Q&A. So I don't believe we have a mic to pass around, do we? We do? These ones, that one? Do we have a tech person? Okay, so here's how this is gonna work. If you have a question, you can raise your hand and then I can get the mic and bring it to you for the people that are online. So we'll repeat the question into the mic so everyone here can hear and everyone attending virtually can hear. Oh, okay. If you'd want, or you can say it and I can repeat it.
I think they want to record it.
I could repeat it. Or you can go to the mic. Okay.
It's not far. You always do that.
So as a lived experience person in Winnipeg who's been on every single point in time count, there have been, as a neighborhood coordinator, so I kind of had an inside look at what was going on day of, and I really appreciate being part of that. But two things. As Elijah will tell you, him and I had some very frank discussions on this particular time count. There were discrepancies. Okay, first of all, in 2020, during COVID, there was a really, really mini count. Whereas we had one person sitting in front of shelters asking people the survey questions. And compared to having 300 people go out the survey before. And in this particular count, we had 160 volunteers, whereas we had 300 in the other two previous prior to COVID. And for Annie, I guess, how does the government adjust to this, especially during the COVID where we had such a, and was this a national thing where we just had this tiny little partial count, or was it just a Winnipeg thing? And also, how do you adjust to 169 volunteers compared to 300? Because that skews numbers, right? And so just my question is, how does the government adjust to that?
Thank you for your question. question, Al. I'm so glad that it's not me who answers it, and it's Sanjeev.
What's that?
All right. So yeah, is this on? Testing. All right. Well, I'll speak loud. So that's a good question, and that is something that we definitely took into consideration when planning when we had to make the adjustments for the point-in-time counts for the pandemic. It was to help mitigate the risks with COVID-19. So, of course, we all know that during the COVID-19 pandemic, we all had to mask, we had to have social distance and everything, and all those measures in place. But an additional measure that we added or provided communities that they could use if they wanted to was to have an implementation of the survey that's more spread out. So instead of just doing it all in one day, you have a longer period to conduct the survey.
Of course, 24 hours, yeah.
So that way, it would help to gain the possibility of those additional survey responses that we might have gotten in 2018 that might not have.
So did you use those?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So they have all been included within the survey. So when we get the data from all the communities, that is the entire survey data that we receive for that whole period. In terms of was it for Winnipeg?
Yeah, Winnipeg.
Winnipeg, right? So the point in time in Winnipeg, if I'm correct, was that in 2021 or?
2022, the most recent.
2022 is the
We
last
did
one.
2022, and then there was a preliminary one in
Yeah.
2020.
2020, yeah.
Okay. So if I remember correctly, the preliminary one, I believe that might have been something with just looking at enumeration numbers, but it wasn't something that was like the full pit count. But from my understanding, the full pit count for Winnipeg was in 2022, which is the data that we received for them in terms of the analysis work that we presented on.
Good, thank you. And great job with the two gentlemen here.
Okay,
Hi.
next question. Okay.
Hi, I'm Stephen Huang from Toronto. Thanks to all of the presenters for great talks. I had a question for Annie Duchesne about the shelter counts. I'm trying to understand what happened during COVID. There was a drop, and I guess that some shelters reduced their capacity, but there were new shelter hotels and other facilities opening. Can you just explain to us what didn't get captured? Because I thought that anything that used HIFAS or HIFAS-like systems would still be captured.
Yeah, so we made a really big effort to try and include those services, those hotel, motel services, those kind of like community center beds, cots that were set up in variety of places. However, when we did a landscape check versus what we were receiving in HIFAS, we saw that the discrepancy was just too large. There was so many services that opened and closed at a variety of points in time throughout 2020 and 2021. And we had probably just the tiniest fraction. And so we made a judgment call. I didn't want to include that and further underestimate. I would rather have really good permanent emergency shelter estimates, and then we could work going forward on capturing that better in the future. So when we're talking about those temporary services, which are still in use and will continue to be in use in a lot of communities, we need to think about how are we going to capture that over the course of a whole year, because when we're looking for capacity, we're usually collecting it at only one time point, which is problematic because, of course, these things open and close throughout the year. So we tried, is my answer. We tried, and we do know that it is an underestimate by quite a lot, and the comparison once you add those extra numbers is a little more on par with what we were seeing in previous years. But of course, we don't want to misrepresent what's happening on the ground. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Yeah.
Hi there, my name is Linda with the Rural Development Network, and I have two questions. So the first question is for all the panelists, and if you mention it, I'm sorry, I think it's only 8:20 right now for me, so I'm just trying to adjust a little bit. Is there any statistics, and I'm probably going to get the language wrong, of people being discharged from institutions like prisons? And if there wasn't any of that, is that something that you're going to look at in the future for the point-in-time counts? And then the other question was, I was just interested to see if any of the point-in-time counts were done on First Nation communities on reserve, Métis Nations, or Métis settlements.
I guess I'll take that one. Do you guys want to go ahead first, or?
I go after you.
Sure. So, yeah, thank you for your question. So, in terms of the locations that are included within the point-in-time counts, the core locations, as we call it in terms of the methodology, there's. Sorry, is this better?
Yeah.
All right, sorry about that. So the core locations would be the unsheltered locations, which are encampments, parks, bus stations, if that's the case. Sheltered emergency shelters, which also include violence against women shelters, as well as those that are provisionally accommodated in transitional housing throughout Canada. So those are some of the core locations that, when it comes to the federal reporting, we report out on. Communities are also able to partner with other organizations within their community or municipality when possible to get data when it comes to systems. So this would include hospitals, institutions, and so on. That's the enumeration side of the point-in-time count. There's also the survey side. The survey side, when we're representing the data on the national perspective, we have a proportion that's specific to those that are in systems, so in institutions and so on. And I think the second question was on First Nations and reserves, and if the point counts were conducted with that. We terribly sorry about that. So when planning the point-in-time counts and when giving the training to the coordinators, what we recommend all communities is to partner with the Indigenous communities within their communities so that it is something that is included within that group and then for that community. Of course, this depends on the availability and the collaboration between the two groups. Thank you.
I can actually expand on that if you want. I'm a policy analyst for Matawa First Nation, which is 9 communities in Northern Ontario. And the question on typhus as well, a part of that problem is, and I'm sure you guys experience this, is that not everyone is on HIFIS. We as a community partner are very new. Our agreement was completed months ago. So our data is very, very new. And I think a lot of the data that comes from this is, as community partners, so all of us in this room need to be a little more responsible to get that to you individuals. So I know it's difficult.
We love you.
With the money coming up, I'm trying to push engagement, but I get that the missing data and stuff, it's frustrating for everyone, for us, for you guys, because we use the pit count, we use that data, and ours in Thunder Bay is identical to Winnipeg's. We're at about a 75% Indigenous rate who identify as. A lot of them from our communities, but you as well as we know, Thunder Bay and Winnipeg are huge catchment areas for communities. And to get the information out of the individual communities is incredibly difficult. And I'm explaining this, I work in the communities, but getting that information and getting it to the right people is an incredibly painful process. I love data, whether it's good or bad, I just want it because this is what pushes programming. This is how we all get money here. That's what we're all here for, is how to get money and realign it, better position it. That's what makes us excited. But yeah, so I just wanted to give a quick little thing about how First Nations are. We are trying to get more information accessible because we also need to work on our own kind of governance of data, because if we want to be represented, we need to represent it. Push how we want that to be in a way that makes sense for both us and for government agencies, because at the end of the day, when we ask a government to change something, we need data to back it up. We need facts, we need figures, we need the numbers. Otherwise, it kind of gets lost in the wash. So we're trying, but we are a little bit behind. And yeah, so I just wanted to, because the 2 points there, I just wanted to clarify for an Indigenous point of view.
Great, thank you, Paul.
Thanks. And for those of you who were online and didn't hear, Paul was just talking about the challenges. He represents a group of 9 First Nations in Northern Ontario, and the challenges getting data back to those First Nations, as well as getting data from those First Nations to government, and there's important work happening there. Just in regards to your question about data from Justice, we did get some data from Justice in 2018, but there was a communication breakdown during the last pit count, and we're working at repairing that to make sure that we get that data again for the next one in 2024. But there are limitations to it as well, because what we got from Manitoba Justice in past surveys was a list of people who were released on the day of that the street census was conducted, so April 24th in 2018, I think it was, and along with the address that they would be released to. And so we were able to cross-check that. If the address they were released to was no fixed address or was a shelter that they were being released to, then that would be then we'd be able to count them. But there were a lot of gaps in that data. Just because somebody is released to an address doesn't mean that they're not they're going to be found. They're going to be able to have housing there on any ongoing basis or any permanent basis. So we know that data is incomplete, and it's only a one-day sample as well, which is a challenge. But that's the data that we were able to get in the past, and we hope to get in the future.
Great, thanks, Josh. I think we have another question at the mic.
Yeah, this one would be for Annie Duchesne, please. Just out of curiosity, I wonder how your team keeps track of, because you were mentioning during your presentation how there's like emergency shelters that open and close, and everything like during the pandemic was kind of going left and right. How does your team like keep track of that, or like keep informed of like what's okay? I see.
No, I mean, painfully is the answer.
Right.
We have a kind of sub-team within my group who works every year to update our national service provider list that includes domestic violence shelters, transitional shelters, and emergency shelters so far. We have talked about adding those temporary shelters given the surge in their use in the past couple of years, although our resources are somewhat limited to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. We'll see. But we work every year to call people, to send out documents, to work with organizations like 211, who we've contracted out to be able to say, okay, what was your capacity? Who did you serve? Where are you located? Has your profile changed? Are you still open? When are you closing? Any new services in your community? All of that gets done. We just finished the round for 2022. So, it's a big to-do. What we're going to try going forward, can I say? Oh, yeah, okay. What we're going to try going forward is we're going to try and use tools like HIFIS to collect this information, to archive it, and just to send it automatically to us so that it eliminates the guesswork. It eliminates this need for communities to for us to call and be like, hey, so how many beds do you have? And who do you serve? We should not have to be able to do that, especially for those who are on our system. So to be able to kind of collect and archive and collect that information without additional burden to the communities would be great.
And then, yeah, that's the dream. And then just out of curiosity, I'm not sure if you know this, but how often was your team sort of late to the game? You found out that a service has already, kind of up and gone?
I mean, it is rare that we're more than a year late.
Okay.
I would say. But, of course, because we're only collecting once a year, we often find out months after the fact that it's closed. Again, this is why having it automatically collected, archived, and sent to us through HIFIS helps a lot when, the activity status goes from active to inactive. It'd be helpful to know. So that's essentially what we're trying to do going forward. Of course, for those services that are not on HIFIS, and there's quite a few, maybe about half the services, emergency services in Canada, we do still need to go through that process, but it doesn't need to be that way for all.
Right. Thank you so much for your response.
No problem.
Thanks. I think we have another question at the mic.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Crisowati from Thunder Bay. At the Lakehead Social Planning Council, we're the community entity for designated Reaching Home funding. And that's great to hear you're using 211 to collect data. Just for anyone that doesn't know, 211 is an organization that collects data on all social services. And what a great way for the government to get that information is using 211 because it's, validated data daily. So just a plug, good to hear you're using that. But my question and kind of comment is, I hear so much, we have to be collective, but then when we need data from government bodies like hospitals, and I know it's provincial, we could use even a form letter, just to send out some support to help get that collaborative effort going. It's great to depend on the Lakehead Social Planning Council to contact all the jails, all the hospitals in the Thunder Bay region, but I can't do it and it's not working and we need help from the federal government for that. So I'm asking a question, but I also use these conferences as queries and asking for help from the feds when I'm here, so that's what I'm doing. We need help to partner with those provincial organizations, and people can pick up phones, we can pick up phones, governments can pick up phones too. So I'd like to see more collaboration between feds and provincial. We used to have conferences like that with municipal, provincial, and feds. That needs to start happening again because without that collective impact, we're not going to solve any of these problems. The federal government can't just function up here and tell us what to do down here, or else we'd have this problem solved by now. So please help us with that collective impact, especially with organizations that need to help with data collections like pit counts, which actually our community depends on pit counts for all of our funding pretty much. So please, that's just a question and a recommendation to the federal government.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question, I think already at the mic.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm from Saskatchewan, and I work for Métis Nation Saskatchewan, and we're the for rural and remote, we're the CE. And so my question is around the pit count. So we're seeing massive migration from rural communities into the urban centers. And I don't think I've talked to colleagues across Canada, I don't think we're in a unique situation in Saskatchewan, but we're seeing homeless encampments in towns as big as 1,000 people. It's very frustrating around not getting designated pit count money to do pit counts in rural and remote communities when we're trying to stem the tide of homelessness in urban centers. And it also hamstrings us because we're told continually, don't fund shelters, try to do second stage housing and whatnot. And then we have no data to go to the province with to pressure them to fund homeless shelters. And so it's this massive disconnect, and it feels like we're not really getting a handle on it. And so just around the pit counts, what is the panel's thoughts on implementing pit counts in rural and remote settings, not just in the larger urban centers, as this is a massive data pool, and because there are limited services in those smaller centers, that's where people are flooding into the larger centers. And so, I can't stress enough, it really does hamstring us. We've had multiple meetings with government, and they say they're not seeing it. Then we talk to the mayor and the reeves and the town councils, and they're saying they've seen it. They've visited countless homeless encampments across Saskatchewan. It's greater, if not more, than the urban encampments. So just your thoughts as a panel on the need for rural and remote pit counts, and same thing for the Indigenous communities, because a lot of times people say it's governance stuff, and then I go talk to chief and councils across the province, and they're dying for funding so that they can conduct a pit count. They want to work collaboratively, but it's a whole other thing to say work collaboratively than to provide no money for on-reserve work and off-reserve work, and I feel like the feds are purposely keeping those lines blurred. So what are your thoughts on that?
Guess that's on me. All right, so thank you for the question. And honestly, yes, we do need to do pit counts in rural and remote communities, because data does show that there are some patterns that could be looked at when it comes to people coming in from rural communities to urban centers, and even medium and small communities. So it's important to get that access to that data and to be able to conduct those. So at this time, we are planning for the 2024 pit counts at a national perspective. And there are tools that are being developed and that we'll be forwarding to communities. And along with that, we will be looking into seeing how a broader range of communities can participate. So we'll be in touch, hopefully, and we could probably share some tools and resources that help communities conduct pit counts when they haven't actually, like, let's say they're doing it for the first time, to see what type of resources and what type of tools could be available, such as guides, templates, reporting material.
You can give us guides, but I'm asking the staff member who's the CEO, bookkeeper, frontline staff, to now go out and do a pit count with their limited volunteer base.
Mhm.
So if there's not funding to accompany it, you give me all the tools in the world, but burnout's real across the sector. So is there going to be funding to come with that, or is it we're on our own to take our limited resources and invest it there?
That is a good question. That is something that we could definitely take back and talk with our higher ups to see what could be done. It is something that is important to look into for sure, because that is a source of data that we all definitely need to look at, and it helps to get a better and broader understanding of the national perspective and situation of homelessness across Canada.
Sorry, I just wanted to let you know, in Toronto, when we had this conference, there was some pit count work done in BC, and one of the questions that they asked the sheltered people is where they came from in rural and remote communities, and they were able to collect a lot of the data by simply asking that question, and so it might help you in your pit count if you were to ask the sheltered people, at least at a minimum, where they're coming from, so that it's not just assumed that they're urban, even though they're in an urban area.
Oh no, absolutely. I totally agree. And that is actually one of the core questions in the point in time count survey. We ask specifically when we ask how long someone has been in the community that they're conducting the pit count in. And if someone says that they've been here, let's say, if someone said they haven't been there for the whole length of their life, they came within a year ago or something like that, then the follow-up question would be to ask, where did you come from? But looking at the data sometimes takes time and has to get analyzed and reviewed and properly cleaned. Sometimes people spell words like city names in 5 different ways. But that's data cleaning in general. Yes. So there was a conference that occurred earlier in, I think it was this year. It's like March or, no, sorry. Earlier, I think it was late spring of this year, looking, I'm referring back to the conference on rural and remote housing. So this is something we did look at in terms of the patterns of migration between rural and remote communities. So we always saw that people in rural communities ended up going to like the next level up to like small and medium. So that is something that we are looking at, and we have done some analysis on. If you want, Jason, if you want, I could send you like the presentation that I had on that. It is something that we had presented on, and happy to share some just for some data and some information to help with things on your end.
Yeah, we in Winnipeg we have done some of that analysis as well, and using that question, it's really diverse, the number of communities that people are coming from, and you know, as somebody just mentioned, there is that constant challenge of the naming of communities as well, because a lot of the communities, a lot of First Nations and Indigenous communities have a colonial name as well as an Indigenous name, and often a nickname as well for the community, and so some of that is a challenge to track, and so it does require a bit of cleaning and sifting through the data as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, perfect. Hi, I'm Marie-Cecile Kodak, and I know some of you have worked in Winnipeg for the longest time with End Homelessness Winnipeg, and now I'm in Calgary doing my doctorate, and my research is on addressing anti-Black racism in the housing and homelessness sector. And one of the challenges that I've experienced is that Black and other non-white, non-Indigenous people are categorized under racialized communities, but we don't collect race-based disaggregated data. So that's the struggle that I'm experiencing. However, I've looked across Canada at the pit counts, and I've seen Halifax collect data on Black communities to understand what their experiences are. Vancouver and Toronto do that, but Winnipeg, Calgary don't. And when we look at those racialized communities, we see an overrepresentation, but we don't know who they are. So my question is, when are we going to start collecting race-based data and disaggregated race-based data to really understand what their challenges are? Because that is heard in the communities that are not being represented in the pit counts, and so we don't know what policies or what interventions should happen to address their challenges experiencing homelessness.
In Winnipeg, that is what we observed. There weren't a lot of newcomers in the sample. For newcomers, usually they experience hidden homelessness. As I speak, one of my younger brothers has moved to Winnipeg to do his master's, and I'm providing accommodation for him. So for those who experience hidden homelessness, it's really difficult to be able to capture them. And I mentioned it's one of the challenges that we do face. However, we are doing our best to be able to capture these categories of people. As I mentioned, for the next pit count, we plan to organize magnet events, promote them so well, and hopefully that will help us to capture a lot more of newcomers experiencing homelessness within the city. And we are also thinking for the magnet events, we can even host them at where newcomers and other racialized groups typically access services to help us reach out to these people.
Yeah, I think there's that misconception that every colored person is a newcomer, but and I know that's the challenge that we've been experiencing. So I think it's not. And when I've asked that question, people have said, "Well, you're covered under immigrants and refugees." No, they're not. Black people have been here since the 1600s.
No.
So it's making sure that we are aware of those misconceptions, making sure that we're collecting that data.
Yeah. We gathered some data on black people, just that they weren't a lot. So I think this question tells us that we need to be more conscious about that and look for ways and means to be able to capture these people in the next pit counts.
As well, I don't believe we collect racial data in the HIFIS reports as well at the shelter level, and so that would be an area, a gap as well.
But not for long. Yeah, we have been working with stakeholders over the past year to workshop and develop a racial identity question in HIFIS that will be capturing racial identities beyond, Indigenous culture, beyond Indigenous identities, so that we can better capture, what's happening among various groups. It is not an exhaustive list. I just want to say that. It's impossible to make an exhaustive list within the confines of how HIFIS works. But it is consistent with what Statistics Canada tends to collect, which means we can look at shelter data versus national data and look at the kind of discrepancies between the two, see where the inequalities are there more easily. So looking forward to the next release of HIFIS, which should have that included, and we'll be able to have data within the next couple of years that's robust enough for us to give some answers about racialized populations in Canada.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for just one.
And just a quick thing in terms of the point-in-time counts, that will and is still one of the core questions in the point-in-time count, so that will remain there, and is also reflective of some of the categories that are in Census Canada when it comes to the racial identity. So that is still something that we'll be continuing to collect with the nationally coordinated point-in-time counts and encourage communities to collect on as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Ahmed Banaktar. I'm with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and then my question would be, so you mentioned like 44% of the people who were surveyed, first experienced homelessness before the age of 25. Do we have any data that speaks to youth experiencing homelessness, like between the age of 13 and 24, and what percentage and probably at what age they first experienced homelessness? Thank you.
So I just want to make sure I heard the question properly. So it was regarding the first experience of homelessness where I forgot the percentage already, but it was regarding people who are experiencing homelessness as a youth. Was that the question?
Yes. So you mentioned like 44% of people experiencing homelessness first experienced homelessness before the age of 25.
Yes.
Do you have any number that speaks to youth experiencing homelessness, specifically that age range, like 13 to 24, and then when they first experienced homelessness, at what age? Thank you.
Perfect. I think I do have something on that. So that's the thing. The 44% is referring to that youth experience. So I'm trying to remember now. I can't remember the exact stats, to be honest with you. It's right not off the top of my head. However, we do have the capability of calculating the average age that when someone is, let's say as a youth, what age they're experiencing. Like there are certain periods that we look at when we're looking at the charts and so on. Like I think it was around, like I said, it was 16, 18, something around that range, but it is something that we could calculate and look into.
Interesting.
There is going to be a final report for the 2020-22 point time counts that is expected to be published soon in the coming weeks that would possibly have information regarding that as well in terms of like what age group specific, like since we're looking on youth, at what specific age as a youth are they experiencing homelessness. But the sorry, but looking at the time, I can't really say for sure, to be honest with you. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, the reason I was asking that question because back in 2016 there was a survey, National Youth Homelessness Survey, and we found that like 40% of youth experiencing homelessness first experienced homelessness before the age of 16. So that's a critical gap, and 40%, that's a staggering number, right? So we need to be mindful of that particular age range. And I just wanted to know that if, there has been some data that could, enlighten us just a little bit more, in how we want to plan for that, because we're working on youth homelessness prevention.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, we should definitely, like I said, we do have data regarding that type of information. It just depends on how we're able to present it out and have it in a way that
Looking forward
everybody's
to
able
reading
understand
the
it.
report.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just to add to what has been said, in Winnipeg, we observe that most people first experience homelessness at 18. And that's the age where they age out of care, they lose all their supports, and it makes it easy for them to enter homelessness. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because sometimes the age range is really important because before the age of 16, even in some provinces, youth are not even qualified to use homelessness services, especially like 13, 14, up to 16. So that's an important thing. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That's actually all the time we have for questions. So we're going to have to break for lunch now, I think. So let's get a round of applause for all of our presenters.